I was 25 years old the first time my entire family decided, unanimously and without hesitation, that I was a failure. The word wasn't spoken outright at first. It came in fragments, in whispers at family gatherings, in polite sighs exchanged between aunts and uncles. In the silent way my parents' eyes slid past me as though my very existence was a disappointment they preferred not to acknowledge. But on one unforgettable evening, during my cousin's engagement party, the verdict was handed down like a sentence carved into stone. I had wasted my life, and they all knew it. The room smelled of jasmine garlands and expensive perfume. Music floated above the chatter and laughter rang across the decorated hall. My cousin Vanessa stood radiant in her sequined gown, her diamond ring catching the chandelier light in a way that seemed choreographed to perfection. Everyone rushed to her side, congratulating her, celebrating her, lifting her up like royalty. And me, I hovered near the edge of the room, clutching a glass of flat soda I hadn't even wanted, pretending I belonged. "You're still not working in anything serious, right?" My uncle's voice boomed, loud enough to draw curious glances. "At your age, I already had 2 children, a mortgage, and a steady income. What do you have?" He didn't ask to know. He asked to wound. I smiled faintly, though my throat tightened. "I'm figuring things out." His laughter was sharp, cruel. "Still figuring things out at 25? My dear, that's just another way of saying you failed." Conversations quieted around us. A ripple of silence spread across the hall. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, her hand tightening around her wine glass. My father stared into the distance, unwilling to intervene. And then Vanessa, the bride-to-be, tilted her head with mock concern. "Don't be so harsh. Some people bloom later than others, though of course, later might already be too late." The laughter that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was worse. It was knowing, collective, as though everyone had been waiting for someone to say it aloud. At 25, I had been officially declared a disappointment. I excused myself and slipped outside, the cold night air pressing against my skin. My phone vibrated with notifications. Friends posting pictures of new jobs, vacations, promotions, lives that looked polished and purposeful. I stared at the glowing screen, the reflection of my face hovering faintly against it. Was this really me, the forgotten daughter, the overlooked cousin, the silent failure? The truth was, I had worked tirelessly for years, but nothing I did ever seemed to matter. After graduating, I had bounced between temporary jobs that never stuck. I had taken risks, invested time in creative pursuits, tried to build something of my own, but each attempt ended in dismissal or ridicule. My parents reminded me constantly of the money they had spent on my education, as though my worth could be calculated like an invoice. My sister, younger by 3 years, had already secured a high-paying corporate job and basked in constant praise, her achievements displayed like trophies my parents polished daily. The contrast was unbearable. She was the golden child, and I was the afterthought. That night, sitting alone in my car, I felt the weight of every insult, every dismissive smile, every reminder that I had failed to meet their expectations. My chest ached with humiliation, my mind replaying their words in endless loops. Failure, useless, too late. But beneath the pain, something else stirred, an ember of defiance, small but steady. For years, I had carried the burden of their judgments like chains, adjusting myself to fit their mold, waiting for their approval like a thirsty traveler waiting for rain. That night, staring at my tear-streaked reflection in the windshield, I made a decision. If they wanted to call me a failure, I would give them a story they could never ignore. The next morning, I rose before dawn. The house was still asleep, the silence thick with unspoken resentments. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, scribbling goals with a hand that trembled less from fear and more from determination. I didn't know exactly how, but I knew one truth with absolute clarity. I would build something undeniable. Not for their approval anymore, but for myself. The journey was far from glamorous. I worked shifts that left my hands raw and my eyes burning. I took freelance projects that paid barely enough to cover rent, swallowing rejection after rejection. But with each failure, I collected lessons like bricks, slowly constructing a foundation others couldn't see. Late nights blurred into dawns as I poured energy into learning, creating, testing, and failing again. My friends stopped inviting me out. My phone grew silent, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running from their judgment. I was running toward my own vision. Months passed. Seasons shifted. My hair grew longer. Darker circles formed beneath my eyes. But something inside me had begun to glow with quiet strength. I launched a small project online, an idea no one believed in, a platform that blended creativity with practicality. At first, it was invisible, a drop in the endless ocean of the internet. But slowly, clicks turned into shares, shares into customers, and customers into loyal supporters. The first time I made more in a week than I had in any of my previous jobs, I sat in stunned silence, the number on the screen almost surreal. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with the thrill of possibility. For the first time, success wasn't theoretical. It was tangible, measurable, mine. Still, I said nothing to my family. I let them believe the old narrative, let them dismiss me at gatherings, let them whisper about my wasted potential. Silence became my armor, secrecy my weapon, because I knew. When the time came, the revelation would strike harder than any defense I could offer. The day arrived sooner than expected. A journalist reached out, intrigued by the growth of my platform. She asked for an interview, and within weeks, the article was live. The headline blazed across the family group chat before I even had the chance to share it myself. Young woman builds breakthrough platform at 25, redefining success against all odds. My phone buzzed with calls, messages, frantic attempts to reach me. Suddenly, the same relatives who had laughed at me wanted details. My sister's voice cracked on voicemail as she asked for advice. My parents' pride, once rationed like a scarce resource, spilled into desperate attempts to reclaim me as their daughter, the success story they had overlooked. But I didn't rush to answer. I sat in my apartment, the evening light spilling across my desk, the quiet hum of the city below grounding me. I thought of that night at Vanessa's engagement party. The laughter, the whispers, the weight of being labeled a failure. And I smiled, not out of spite, but out of recognition. They had written me off too soon. The article spread faster than I imagined. It wasn't just on the local site anymore. Bigger outlets picked it up, resharing the story as though I had become some symbol of perseverance. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years resurfaced in my inbox, congratulating me, telling me how they always knew I had potential. Even distant acquaintances from school messaged to say they'd seen my name on their newsfeed. But the messages that mattered most, the ones that carried a strange mix of vindication and sorrow, came from my family. My mother called first, her voice shaky with a performance she had rehearsed countless times. "We're so proud of you," she said, drawing out each word like a prayer. "We always knew you'd make it." I listened silently, my lips pressed together. Pride was a currency she had hoarded all my life, spending it generously on my sister, never sparing even loose change for me. Now, suddenly, I was the recipient of her abundance. My father followed, his tone clipped but laced with urgency. "You should have told us sooner. We could have helped. We could have introduced you to people." The irony made me laugh softly. Where was this help when I was working double shifts? Where were these introductions when I was invisible at family gatherings? My sister's message was longer. She texted paragraphs of half apologies mixed with envy, as though writing them would erase years of condescension. "You've done so well. Honestly, I didn't expect it. Everyone's talking about you. Maybe you can guide me, you know? I could use some advice." I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because silence sometimes speaks louder than forgiveness. Weeks later, I attended another family gathering. This time, it was my cousin Vanessa's wedding, the same cousin who had once mocked me with pity disguised as compassion. The hall was just as extravagant, the chandeliers brighter, the music louder, the air thick with perfume and wealth. But the atmosphere shifted the moment I entered. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Whispers spread like wildfire. "There she is," someone muttered. "Did you see the article? That's her. I can't believe it. She's the one everyone's talking about." For the first time in my life, I wasn't the shadow in the corner. I was the story in the spotlight. I walked with my head high, not out of arrogance, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived ridicule and turned it into fuel. Relatives who once avoided eye contact now scrambled to greet me, their smiles too wide, their compliments too rehearsed. My uncle, the one who had mocked me openly at the engagement party, approached with a booming laugh. "Ah, our little star. I always said you had it in you." I tilted my head, meeting his eyes. "No, you didn't," I replied calmly. His laughter faltered, and the silence that followed was more satisfying than applause. At the dinner table, my parents tried to reclaim me as their pride and joy. They introduced me to distant relatives with words like brilliant, determined, visionary. I smiled politely, but deep down, I knew this wasn't about me. It was about them trying to rewrite the narrative they had once created. And then came the moment that crystallized everything. My father, in front of half the family, raised a glass. "To my daughter," he said, his voice trembling with forced sincerity. "She has shown us all that success takes patience and resilience. We're lucky to call her ours." The words should have made me feel vindicated, triumphant even, but instead I felt a hollow ache. Because it wasn't just about being acknowledged. It was about the years when acknowledgement had been withheld. About the countless moments when I had stood alone while they cheered for someone else. Recognition now felt like too little, too late. After the toast, my sister pulled me aside. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, her designer dress a little too tight, as though success had weighed heavily on her. "You know," she whispered, "they've been struggling since the article came out. They talk about you nonstop. Dad lost some business deals because people kept asking why they didn't support you. Mom's friends are asking questions." I stared at her, the words settling like stones in my stomach. For so long, I had wanted their recognition, but now that I had it, I realized it had never been about them. My worth had never depended on their applause. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window overlooking the city. The skyline glittered, alive with stories unfolding in 1,000 windows. I thought about the journey, the insults, the sleepless nights, the failures that piled like rubble until they became a foundation. I thought about the girl who had been called a failure at 25. That girl no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had learned the most important truth. Success is not a headline, not a toast, not even validation. Success is the quiet certainty that you no longer need permission to be who you are. In the months that followed, my life didn't become a fairy tale. There were still setbacks, still days when doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. But there was also freedom. Freedom from the weight of their judgments. Freedom from needing their approval. My work grew, my voice reached further, and I realized that the very label they had once used to diminish me had become the spark that lit everything on fire. At 25, they called me a failure. At 26, I built something stronger than their expectations. By 27, I was no longer just part of the family story. I was the headline they could never rewrite. And perhaps the sweetest part was this. When people whispered my name now, it wasn't with pity or laughter. It was with curiosity, with respect, with awe. They had underestimated me, and I had let them. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't proving them wrong immediately. Sometimes the best revenge is waiting until the moment they're certain you've lost, only to rise higher than they ever believed you could. My comeback wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about applause. It wasn't about silencing their laughter. My comeback was about reclaiming myself. And that, more than anything else, made me unstoppable.